The tranquilizer gun slipped from Tom Harrison's weathered hands, clattering against the red Kenyan earth as 5 lionesses formed a perfect circle around him. At 62, the retired veterinarian had seen death before, in Vietnam, in Dorothy's hospital room, but never like this. The massive male lion trapped in steel jaws wasn't snarling or thrashing. He was watching Tom with golden eyes that seemed almost grateful. "Jesus Christ," whispered Dr. Sarah Chen from behind the jeep, her camera capturing what shouldn't be possible. The lionesses weren't protecting their mate from the human, they were protecting the human from everything else. Tom's hands trembled as he knelt in the dust, remembering Dorothy's last words. Find something worth living for. The lion's breathing grew shallow, blood pooling beneath the cruel metal trap. "Call the ranger station," Tom ordered, never breaking eye contact with the dying king. "Tell them we've got a situation they've never seen before." But what he was about to discover would change everything he thought he knew about family. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Tom Harrison had always believed that running away was for cowards, but here in the vast expanse of the Masai Mara, he'd been doing exactly that for 8 months. The morning sun cast long shadows across the acacia trees as he sat on the porch of his shared volunteer cabin, cradling a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. At 62, his hands bore the maps of 4 decades treating farm animals in Nebraska. Calloused palms, fingers bent slightly from countless hours of delicate work, and a wedding ring he still couldn't bring himself to remove. Dorothy had been gone 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not that he was counting. The cancer had taken her slowly, methodically, the way drought takes a cornfield, leaf by leaf until nothing remains but stubble and memory. Their farmhouse back in Kearney still held the ghost of her laughter, the indent in her favorite reading chair, the half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen table that he'd left exactly as she'd placed it that final morning. "Promise me you'll find something worth living for," she'd whispered during those last, lucid moments, her voice barely audible above the hospital's mechanical symphony. He'd nodded, squeezed her hand, and lied through his teeth. "I promise, Dot." The International Wildlife Medical Initiative had seemed like salvation, a chance to use his veterinary skills while putting an ocean between himself and the suffocating sympathy of small-town Nebraska. But 8 months in Kenya had taught him that geography couldn't outrun grief. Every sunset reminded him of evenings spent on their front porch swing. Every morning brought the muscle memory of brewing coffee for 2. His daughter Emma called it running away to play Tarzan during one of their increasingly rare conversations. At 35, she'd built a successful life in California. Marriage, career, independence, while he'd built walls. Their last real conversation had been at Dorothy's funeral, and even then, they'd hidden behind logistics and funeral arrangements rather than facing the gaping hole left in both their lives. 40 years fixing broken animals, and I can't even fix my own broken heart, he muttered to himself, a habit he'd developed since living alone. The radio in his cabin crackled with the morning check-in from base camp, but Tom ignored it. Protocol dictated that volunteers travel in pairs, but he'd grown tired of making small talk with eager young conservationists who saw Africa as an adventure rather than exile. The Masai Mara stretched endlessly before him, a golden sea of grass punctuated by umbrella thorns and the distant silhouettes of grazing zebras. Somewhere out there, life continued its ancient rhythms, predator and prey, birth and death, the eternal dance that had played out long before humans arrived with their complications and regrets. Tom finished his cold coffee and reached for his keys. Today, like every day, he would drive the perimeter roads alone, checking water sources and documenting wildlife movements. It wasn't much of a purpose, but it was something. And for now, something was enough to keep Dorothy's promise alive. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, and Tom should have turned back. Protocol was clear. Never venture into the remote sectors without communication. Never travel alone, and never deviate from approved routes. But at 62, he'd grown weary of following other people's rules, especially when those rules felt designed for people who still believed they had something to lose. The morning air carried the familiar scents of the Mara, dry grass, acacia blossoms, and something else. Something wrong. Tom slowed the jeep, his veterinarian instincts picking up signals that had nothing to do with the radio's mechanical failures. The birds were wrong. Vultures circled in tight spirals about a mile ahead, but their pattern was hesitant, uncertain. Scavengers that should have been feeding were instead maintaining altitude, as if something below was preventing their usual efficiency. He'd seen this behavior before, back in Nebraska, when predators lingered near carrion, but this felt different. The very air seemed to hold its breath. Tom pulled out his binoculars and scanned the area ahead. Through the heat shimmer, he could make out dark shapes clustered near a small grove of fever trees. Not the scattered randomness of a natural death, but something deliberate, organized. His hands, still steady despite 3 cups of morning coffee and 62 years of living, adjusted the focus. What he saw made his blood run cold. 5 lionesses sat in a perfect semicircle, their tawny bodies motionless as statues. They weren't feeding, weren't moving, weren't exhibiting any of the behaviors he'd learned to expect from big cats. They were simply waiting. And at the center of their formation, barely visible through the grass, was a splash of gold that could only be a male lion. Tom's radio crackled once more before dying completely. The silence that followed felt profound, as if the entire savannah was holding its breath. He should drive back to camp, report the sighting, wait for backup. That's what protocol demanded. That's what a sensible 62-year-old man would do. Instead, he thought of Dorothy's voice during those final weeks. "Tommy, you've spent 40 years healing things. Don't stop now, just because I'm gone." The Jeep's engine seemed unnaturally loud as he drove closer, but the lionesses didn't flee. If anything, they seemed to acknowledge his approach with a barely perceptible shift in posture. Not aggressive, not defensive. Something else entirely. Something he'd never seen in 40 years of working with animals. As he drew within 50 yards, the scene became devastatingly clear. The male lion, magnificent even in distress, was caught in what appeared to be a steel-jawed trap. The kind used by poachers, designed for animals much smaller than a 400-pound lion. Blood had soaked into the red earth beneath him, and his breathing was labored, shallow. His golden mane was matted with dust and sweat, but it was his eyes that stopped Tom cold. Those amber orbs held an intelligence that transcended species, a resignation mixed with something that looked disturbingly like hope. As if the great cat had been waiting, as if he somehow knew help would come. The 5 lionesses turned their heads in unison to watch Tom's approach. Their eyes held the same strange intelligence, the same impossible calm. In 40 years of veterinary practice, through countless encounters with frightened and wounded animals, Tom had never experienced anything like this. These weren't wild animals protecting their injured leader. They were sentinels, guardians, almost as if they were expecting him. Tom cut the engine and sat in the sudden silence, his heart hammering against his ribs. The smart play was to retreat, call for help, wait for a team with proper equipment and tranquilizer guns. He was one man, past retirement age, with nothing but a basic field medical kit and hands that shook more than they used to. But the male lion lifted his massive head slightly, and their eyes met across the space between species, between worlds. In that moment, Tom heard Dorothy's voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside him. "Do what's right, Tommy, not what's easy." The trap's steel jaws had bitten deep into the lion's right foreleg, and Tom could see bone beneath the torn flesh. Without immediate medical intervention, the animal would be dead within hours. Blood loss, shock, infection, any number of factors could kill him. And judging by the lioness's behavior, they seemed to understand this as well as he did. Tom reached for his medical kit with hands that had steadied. 40 years of emergency calls, of desperate midnight surgeries in barn stalls, of life and death decisions made in split seconds had prepared him for this moment. He might be a widowed old man running from his grief, but he was still a veterinarian, and this magnificent creature needed him. The lionesses watched as he stepped out of the jeep, their golden eyes tracking his every movement with an intensity that should have been terrifying but somehow felt like benediction. Tom's boots crunched against the dry grass as he approached the injured lion, his medical kit clutched in hands that had performed surgery on everything from prize bulls to barn cats. The 5 lionesses shifted slightly, their powerful muscles rippling beneath golden coats. But they didn't retreat. Instead, they seemed to part just enough to allow him passage. A corridor of trust that defied every law of nature he'd learned in 4 decades of veterinary practice. The male lion's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, each exhale accompanied by a low rumble that spoke of pain beyond measure. Tom knelt slowly, maintaining eye contact with the magnificent creature whose amber gaze held an intelligence that made his chest tighten. Up close, the trap's damage was even worse than he'd feared. The steel jaws had crushed through muscle and sinew, creating a wound that would challenge even a fully equipped surgical suite. "Easy, big fellow," Tom whispered, his Nebraska drawl somehow seeming appropriate in the African heat. "I know it hurts like hell, but we're going to get you out of this mess." The lion's response was a soft chuff. Not aggressive, not fearful, but something that sounded almost like acknowledgement. Tom had heard similar sounds from countless patients over the years, that moment when a wounded animal seemed to understand that help had arrived. But this felt different. This felt like communication. As Tom opened his medical kit, his fingers found the familiar comfort of instruments he'd used for decades. Scalpels, sutures, antiseptic, tools that had served him well in Nebraska barns were now deployed under the vast African sky. The lionesses watched his every movement with what could only be described as professional interest, as if they were evaluating his qualifications for the job at hand. The trap mechanism was more complex than anything he'd encountered. Military-grade steel, designed to hold animals far smaller than a 400-pound lion, which explained why the damage was so severe. The creature's struggles had only made things worse, the serrated edges cutting deeper with each attempt to break free. Tom's hands explored the mechanism carefully, his years of experience with farm equipment serving him well as he traced the release points. "This is going to hurt, son," he murmured to the lion, preparing a sedative injection. "But we need to do this if you're going to see another sunset." The needle slid into the massive shoulder with practiced precision, and Tom was amazed when the lion barely flinched. Those golden eyes remained fixed on his face, as if the great cat was choosing to trust this strange bipedal creature who smelled of antiseptic and old grief. As the sedative began to take effect, Tom worked to assess the full extent of the injuries. The trap had been in place for hours, possibly since dawn, based on the dried blood patterns and the degree of swelling. Circulation to the lower leg was compromised, and infection was already setting in. Without proper surgical intervention, amputation might be the only option, if the lion lived long enough for such procedures. The lionesses had arranged themselves in a perfect defensive circle, but their attention wasn't focused outward. Instead, They watched Tom's work with the intensity of surgical students, their ears swiveling to catch every sound he made. It was unprecedented behavior that would have fascinated animal behaviorists, but Tom was too focused on his patient to fully appreciate the scientific implications. Working by feel as much as sight, Tom began the delicate process of disengaging the trap's mechanism. The steel was slick with blood, making grip difficult, and his 62-year-old hands weren't as steady as they'd been during his prime years. But muscle memory guided him. The same instincts that had saved countless animals in emergency situations taking over. The first mechanism released with a metallic click that seemed to echo across the savanna. The lion's breathing eased slightly, and one of the lionesses made a sound that Tom could have sworn was approval. He continued working, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning coolness, his complete attention focused on the task at hand. The second release point was more stubborn, corroded with blood and designed to prevent exactly what Tom was attempting. His hands cramped from the awkward angle, and for a moment doubt crept in. What was he doing? A retired farm veterinarian trying to perform field surgery on one of Africa's apex predators, surrounded by 5 potentially lethal lionesses with no backup and no communication. But then the lion's eyes found his again, and Tom saw something there that made his breath catch: recognition. Not just of his intent to help, but something deeper. Something that suggested this wasn't their first encounter, though Tom couldn't place where or when he might have seen this particular animal before. The moment passed as the second mechanism finally yielded to Tom's persistence. The trap's jaws opened slightly, releasing some of the crushing pressure on the lion's leg. Blood flow resumed with a rush that was both encouraging and alarming. Circulation was returning, but so was significant bleeding. Tom worked quickly to pack the wounds with gauze, his movements efficient despite the surreal circumstances. The lionesses had moved closer now, close enough that he could feel their breath on his shoulders, but their presence felt protective rather than threatening. It was as if they understood that this strange human was their injured companion's best hope for survival. The final mechanism was the most challenging, requiring Tom to reach partially underneath the lion's massive body. As he positioned himself for the awkward angle, one of the lionesses, the largest, clearly the pride's matriarch, moved to support the lion's weight, easing the pressure on the trap and allowing Tom better access. The cooperation was so deliberate, so intelligent, that Tom paused in his work to stare at her. Those golden eyes met his with what could only be described as determination. She knew what needed to be done, and she was making it possible. With renewed confidence, Tom worked the final release. The trap opened completely with a grinding screech of tortured metal, and the lion's leg was finally free. The trap clattered to the ground with a finality that seemed to release something in the air itself. Tom's hands moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning and disinfecting the wounds while the lion remained remarkably still under sedation. The damage was extensive: deep lacerations that would require careful suturing, possible bone fractures that couldn't be properly assessed without x-rays, and tissue damage that spoke of hours of agony. But the leg was intact, circulation was returning, and the great cat's breathing had steadied. As Tom worked, he found himself talking to his patient the way he always had with animals back in Nebraska. "You're a tough old boy, aren't you? Probably been through worse than this. Hell, those scars on your shoulder tell quite a story." His fingers traced old healed wounds across the lion's flank, territorial battles perhaps, or encounters with other predators. This was a survivor, a king who had fought for his crown and kept it. The lionesses maintained their vigil, but their posture had relaxed from high alert to something approaching curiosity. The matriarch, a scarred female with intelligent eyes, had positioned herself closest to Tom's work, occasionally making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like commentary. Tom found himself addressing her directly as he worked. "I know, girl. This is probably the strangest thing you've ever seen. Hell, it's the strangest thing I've ever done, and I once delivered a calf during a tornado in '97. The memory brought a brief smile to his weathered face. Dorothy had waited up all night for him that evening, hot coffee and worried questions ready when he finally returned home covered in mud and birth fluids. The thought of Dorothy sent a familiar pang through his chest, but this time it wasn't pure grief. For the first time in 3 years, he was doing exactly what she'd always admired about him, using his skills to heal something broken, to fight death when it came calling too early. His hands steadied as muscle memory took over, fingers that had sutured countless wounds falling into the rhythm that had defined his professional life. The sun climbed higher as Tom worked, its heat beginning to shimmer off the grassland in waves. Sweat dripped into his eyes, but he didn't dare stop to wipe it away. The suturing required precise work, and despite the sedation, the lion's massive body occasionally twitched with involuntary responses to pain. Each time, the lionesses would shift closer, as if offering comfort to their injured leader. It was during one of these tender moments that Tom heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. The engine noise was wrong, too loud, too aggressive for the careful approach protocols used by reserve rangers. His hands paused in their work as dust clouds appeared on the horizon, moving fast across the savanna in their direction. The lioness's reaction was immediate and dramatic. 5 heads snapped toward the approaching vehicle, ears flattened, lips beginning to curl back from lethal canines. The matriarch rose to her feet, positioning herself between the unconscious male and the approaching threat. The change in atmosphere was electric. These were no longer docile observers but apex predators preparing for battle. Tom's military training kicked in, senses sharpening as he assessed the situation. One vehicle, moving too fast for a routine patrol, heading directly for their position despite the clear presence of lions. Either someone was in serious trouble, or someone was looking for trouble. Given the sophisticated nature of the trap he'd just removed, Tom was betting on the latter. The vehicle, a battered Land Rover with reinforced bumpers and roof racks, skidded to a halt 50 yards away, close enough to be threatening but far enough to provide an escape route. Tom continued his suturing, but his peripheral vision tracked the figure emerging from the driver's seat, male, approximately 45, wearing expensive hunting gear despite the morning heat, rifle in hand but not immediately threatening. Yet, "Step away from my property," the man called out in accented English. South African, Tom thought, though he'd never been good with regional dialects. "That lion is mine." Tom didn't look up from his work, though every fiber of his being wanted to turn and face this new threat. "Last I checked, wildlife in the Masai Mara doesn't belong to anyone but Kenya," he replied, his Nebraska drawl steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "And this particular animal needs medical attention." The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Medical attention? It's a wild animal, old man. Step away before you get hurt." Now Tom did look up, his blue eyes meeting the stranger's across the space between them. The lionesses had spread out in a loose formation that any military tactician would recognize as a flanking maneuver. They weren't just protecting their injured companion, they were protecting Tom as well. "The name's Tom Harrison," he said, returning to his suturing, "and I've been getting hurt by animals for 40 years. Somehow I've managed to survive." He tied off another stitch with practiced efficiency. "What's your interest in this particular lion?" The stranger's grip tightened on his rifle, though he kept it pointed downward. "Marcus van der Merwe. And that animal destroyed my family's livelihood. Killed 12 head of cattle last month. I have every right to collect compensation." Tom's hands never paused in their work, but his mind raced. Van der Merwe. The name triggered something, a memory he couldn't quite place. More importantly, the man's story didn't add up. This lion had been trapped for hours, possibly days, and showed no signs of having been anywhere near cattle recently. The wounds were too clean, too precise for a scavenging hunt gone wrong. 12 head of cattle, Tom repeated thoughtfully. That's a substantial loss. Strange, though. This fellow's been trapped long enough that rigor mortis should be setting in, but his stomach's empty. Doesn't look like he's eaten anything substantial in days. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, and Tom noticed the movement. 40 years of reading animals had taught him to read people as well, and Marcus van der Merwe was definitely hiding something. The expensive gear, the sophisticated trap, the convenient arrival just as Tom had freed the lion, none of it felt like the actions of a simple cattle rancher seeking justice. "You don't understand the situation here," Marcus said, taking a step closer. The lionesses immediately responded, the matriarch's low growl carrying a warning that needed no translation. "This is Africa, not some American zoo. Animals die here. It's the natural order." Tom finished his final suture and began bandaging the lion's leg with strips torn from his spare shirt. The great cat's breathing had deepened, entering what appeared to be natural sleep rather than sedative unconsciousness. A good sign. The trauma was manageable, the blood loss controlled. "You know what I learned in 40 years of veterinary practice?" Tom said conversationally, his hands gentle as they secured the bandages. "Animals don't usually end up in sophisticated military-grade traps by accident. Those cost serious money, require specialized knowledge to set properly." He looked up at Marcus again, noting the man's increasing agitation. "Makes a fellow wonder who might have that kind of equipment readily available." The standoff stretched between them, tension thick as the rising heat. The lionesses had positioned themselves strategically, one at each point of approach, creating a living barrier around Tom and their injured leader. Their eyes never left Marcus, who seemed to be weighing his options with increasing desperation. It was then that Tom noticed the radio equipment in Marcus's vehicle, far more sophisticated than anything a cattle rancher would need. Professional grade, military surplus by the look of it. The kind of gear used by people who needed to coordinate complex operations across vast distances. People like... "You're not a rancher," Tom said quietly, the pieces falling into place. "You're a poacher." Marcus's face hardened, but before he could respond, the radio in his vehicle crackled to life. A woman's voice, clear and urgent. "Marcus, this is Emma. Do you copy?" "I've been trying to reach my father for hours. Tom Harrison, last seen heading toward Sector 7. Please respond if you've seen him." The blood drained from Tom's face as recognition hit him like a physical blow. Emma. His daughter Emma, who lived in California, who barely spoke to him anymore, who had no reason to be in Kenya or to know Marcus van der Merwe. The radio crackled again, more insistent now. "Marcus, please. I know you're monitoring this frequency. Dad's radio went dead 3 hours ago, and the GPS tracker shows he's in your area. I'm scared something's happened to him." Tom stared at Marcus with dawning horror and understanding. This wasn't a chance encounter. This wasn't about cattle or even poaching. This was personal. And somehow his estranged daughter was involved with a man who had just tried to claim ownership of a lion that Tom had risked his life to save. The great cat stirred beneath Tom's hands, golden eyes beginning to flutter open as the sedative wore off. The lionesses sensed the change immediately, their attention shifting between their awakening leader and the two humans locked in their tense confrontation. And in that moment, as the African sun beat down on this impossible scene, Tom realized that whatever was happening here was far more complicated than a simple rescue mission. His daughter's voice continued to call over the radio, growing more desperate with each unanswered transmission, while Marcus van der Merwe stood 30 feet away with secrets written across his face and a rifle in his hands. The lion's eyes opened fully, focusing immediately on Tom's face with that same strange recognition he'd felt earlier. And for the first time since Dorothy's death, Tom Harrison understood that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, even if he had no idea what came next. The lion's eyes locked onto Tom's face with an intensity that made the old veterinarian's breath catch. There was something there, recognition, gratitude, and something deeper that transcended the usual animal-human barrier. The great cat attempted to rise, favoring his injured leg, but managing to lift his massive head with regal dignity. The 5 lionesses immediately moved closer, forming a protective semicircle that included Tom within their defensive perimeter. Marcus's radio crackled again, Emma's voice cutting through the African air like a knife through Tom's heart. "Marcus, I'm tracking Dad's GPS signal. It shows he's stationary in your sector. Please, if something's happened to him—" Her voice broke slightly, revealing a vulnerability that Tom hadn't heard since she was a child waking from nightmares. "Turn off that radio," Tom said quietly, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. The puzzle pieces were forming a picture he didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. "And start explaining how my daughter knows you." Marcus's hand moved toward the radio but hesitated. The lionesses sensed the tension, their low rumbles creating a bass note that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The injured male lion struggled to his feet, swaying slightly but maintaining his stance beside Tom. For a moment, the old veterinarian felt what it might be like to be part of a pride. Protected, valued, essential. "Your daughter hired me," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying a weight that spoke of complicated truths. 6 months ago. She's been trying to find you, Tom. Not just locate you, but understand you. Why you left Nebraska, why you stopped calling, why you chose Africa over family." The words hit Tom like physical blows. Emma had been looking for him. All these months of silence, of assuming she was too busy with her California life to care about her grieving father, and she'd been, what, hiring investigators? "That's impossible," Tom said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Emma barely speaks to me, hasn't since Dorothy's funeral." "Because she doesn't know how," Marcus replied, lowering his rifle but keeping it ready. "Do you know what she told me when she first contacted me? She said her father was the strongest man she'd ever known, but that losing her mother had broken something in him that she didn't know how to fix." The lion beside Tom made a soft, chuffing sound, as if offering commentary on the human drama unfolding around him. One of the lionesses, the youngest, Tom thought, based on her smaller size and unblemished coat, approached and gently nuzzled the male's uninjured shoulder. The gesture was so tender, so clearly supportive, that Tom felt an unexpected sting of tears. Emma's voice came through the radio again, more urgent now. "Marcus, I'm getting reports of gunshots in Sector 7. If someone's hunting illegally in Dad's area—" The transmission cut off, leaving only static. "There were no gunshots," Marcus said quickly, noting Tom's alarm. "I haven't fired a single round, but Emma's worried sick. She flew in from California 2 days ago, been coordinating search efforts with the ranger stations. She thinks something's happened to you." "She flew here?" Tom couldn't process this information. His Emma, who'd built a successful veterinary practice in San Diego, who'd always been too busy for extended phone calls, had dropped everything to come to Kenya. "Why would she do that?" Marcus set his rifle down carefully, hands raised to show he was no longer a threat. The lionesses noted the gesture but maintained their protective formation. "Because she got a letter from your wife. Dorothy left instructions that it should be delivered 3 years after her death." The world seemed to tilt around Tom. Dorothy had written Emma a letter. His mind raced back to those final weeks, remembering how she'd insisted on spending hours writing what he'd assumed were thank-you notes to friends and medical staff. She'd been so secretive about it, dismissing his offers to help as unnecessary fussing. What did the letter say? Tom's voice was barely a whisper. "That's between you and Emma. But I can tell you it changed everything for her. She realized she'd been grieving wrong, just like you have, pushing away instead of pulling together." Marcus gestured toward the radio. "She's been tracking your movements for weeks, trying to work up the courage to just show up and force a conversation. Today, when your GPS stopped moving and your radio went silent, she panicked." The male lion had managed to take a few tentative steps, testing his injured leg. Tom watched with professional satisfaction as the great cat distributed his weight carefully, favoring the wounded limb but clearly capable of movement. The bandages were holding, the bleeding had stopped, and barring infection, the animal would likely make a full recovery. "You still haven't explained the trap," Tom said, though some of his earlier suspicion had faded. "Or why you're carrying enough firepower to outfit a small army." Marcus had the grace to look embarrassed. "I'm not a poacher, Tom. I'm a private investigator, but I specialize in anti-poaching operations. That trap, I've been tracking the bastards who set it for 3 weeks. When Emma hired me to find you, I realized your volunteer sector overlapped with my investigation area. I thought I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, locate you for your daughter and gather evidence on the poaching ring." "So you've been following me?" "Not following, monitoring. There's a difference." Marcus pulled out a tablet showing GPS tracking data. "Emma was worried about your safety, especially after you started going out alone in violation of protocols. I was supposed to be your invisible guardian angel, making sure you didn't get yourself killed while she worked up the courage to contact you directly." Tom studied the data, seeing his own movement patterns mapped out over weeks. Every solo journey, every protocol violation, every moment he'd thought he was completely alone, Emma had known about it all. The revelation was staggering in its implications. His daughter hadn't been ignoring him. She'd been protecting him from a distance. The radio crackled again, a different voice this time, male, authoritative. "This is Ranger Captain Kimani to all units in Sector 7. We have reports of a medical emergency involving Dr. Harrison. Helicopter en route with medical team. ETA 15 minutes. She called in a rescue operation, Marcus said unnecessarily. When your GPS stopped moving, Emma assumed the worst. There's a full search and rescue team coming, including a veterinary unit she specifically requested." "A veterinary unit?" Tom looked at his bandaged patient, who seemed to be growing stronger by the moment. "For me? She said you'd never forgive yourself if you were injured in a way that prevented you from helping animals. She knows you, Tom, better than you think." The sound of helicopter rotors began to echo across the savannah, distant but approaching fast. The lionesses looked up with interest, but not alarm. They'd clearly encountered aircraft before. The male lion, however, began to show signs of agitation. His ears flattened, and he made a sound that Tom recognized as distress. "He's afraid they'll take him away," Tom realized. "Separate him from his pride." Without thinking, Tom reached out and placed his hand on the lion's massive shoulder. The contact should have been dangerous. A wild predator, recently injured, now facing the stress of approaching humans. Instead, the great cat leaned into the touch, accepting comfort from this strange two-legged creature who had freed him from steel jaws. "We won't let that happen," Tom murmured, though he had no idea how he could make such a promise. "You belong with your family." The words hung in the air, heavy with multiple meanings. The helicopter was clearly visible now, approaching from the east with the distinctive profile of a medical evacuation aircraft. Tom could imagine Emma in the passenger seat, probably arguing with the pilot about landing procedures and safety protocols, just as Dorothy used to do when she was worried about him. Marcus was speaking into his radio, coordinating with the incoming team, but Tom's attention was fixed on the pride around him. 5 lionesses and 1 injured male, a family unit that had accepted him as worthy of protection. They could have fled when the helicopter approached, could have abandoned their injured leader to human interference. Instead, they maintained their positions, ready to defend what they valued most. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here, in the middle of the African wilderness, surrounded by apex predators, Tom Harrison had found the family unity that had eluded him since Dorothy's death. And somewhere in that approaching helicopter was his daughter, who had been seeking the same connection all along. The lion beside him stirred, lifting his great head to study Tom's face one more time. Those golden eyes held a message that transcended species barriers: gratitude, respect, and something that looked remarkably like understanding. Then, with dignity intact despite his injuries, the king of beasts began to limp toward his lionesses, ready to lead his pride to safety before the humans could complicate their lives further. But as he moved away, he paused, looking back at Tom with an expression that seemed to say, "This isn't goodbye." The helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash, its medical markings bright against the golden grassland. Tom watched through the settling dust cloud as figures emerged from the aircraft, but his eyes were fixed on one person in particular. Emma Harrison stepped onto African soil with the determined stride he remembered from her childhood. The same purposeful walk she'd used when marching to defend a wounded bird or confront playground bullies. At 35, she had Dorothy's auburn hair and his own stubborn jaw, but there was something different about her now. A gravity, a weight of purpose that hadn't been there at Dorothy's funeral. She wore practical khaki clothing and carried a veterinary field kit that looked far more comprehensive than his own makeshift supplies. "Dad!" Her voice carried across the distance between them, and Tom felt something crack open in his chest. A wall he'd built so carefully over 3 years of grief and self-imposed exile. She was running now, medical training forgotten in the face of seeing her father alive and whole. Tom met her halfway, and for a moment they simply held each other in the African heat. She felt smaller than he remembered, more fragile. But her grip was fierce with relief and something else, an anger that vibrated just beneath the surface. "You stubborn, impossible man," she whispered against his shoulder. "Do you have any idea what you've put me through? 8 months of radio silence, and then this morning your GPS goes dead and Marcus can't raise you on communications. Emma, don't." She pulled back to look at him, and Tom saw Dorothy's fire in her green eyes. "Don't you dare apologize or make excuses. We're going to have a very long conversation about communication and family obligations, but first," she looked past him toward where the lion pride had been, "Marcus said you performed field surgery on a lion. Are you completely insane?" The pride had retreated to a safe distance but remained visible, the injured male standing proudly among his lionesses despite his bandaged leg. Tom followed Emma's gaze and felt a surge of professional pride. He was caught in a poacher's trap. Military-grade steel probably would have killed him within hours if I hadn't intervened. Emma stared at the lions, then at her father, then back at the lions. "You operated on a 400-pound predator, in the field, alone, at 62 years old." "Well, when you put it like that, it does sound a bit reckless," Tom admitted. "A bit reckless?" Emma's voice climbed an octave. "Dad, you could have been killed. What were you thinking?" The question hung between them, loaded with 3 years of unspoken grief and misunderstanding. Tom looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw the fear that had been driving her anger. She was terrified of losing him the way they'd both lost Dorothy. Terrified that his self-imposed exile was really a slow form of suicide, I was thinking, Tom said quietly, that for the first time since your mother died I had found something worth saving. The medical team had approached during their reunion, but maintained a respectful distance. Tom recognized the lead physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the younger volunteers at the medical initiative. She'd been present during several of his animal encounters, always professional but clearly fascinated by his unconventional methods. "Dr. Harrison," Sarah called out, "we need to check you for injuries and document the lion encounter. This kind of human-animal interaction is unprecedented." Emma's head snapped toward the younger woman. "Dr. Harrison, you're working with my father?" "Your father is something of a legend among the veterinary volunteers," Sarah replied. "His field techniques are unorthodox, but remarkably effective. We've been documenting his work for potential publication in veterinary journals." Tom saw Emma's expression shift from anger to confusion to something that might have been pride. "Publication? Your father has developed several innovative field treatment protocols that could revolutionize emergency veterinary care in remote locations," Sarah continued enthusiastically. "His adaptation of human combat medic techniques to large animal surgery has saved dozens of animals that would have been considered lost causes." "Dozens?" Emma looked at Tom with new eyes. "Dad, you never mentioned—" "You never asked," Tom said simply, and immediately regretted the words when he saw her flinch. "Emma, I'm sorry. That wasn't fair." The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their conversation. 2 ranger trucks and what appeared to be a mobile veterinary unit were heading toward them across the grassland. Tom recognized the lead vehicle's driver, John Kimani, the sector captain who'd been coordinating anti-poaching efforts in the region. "This is getting complicated," Marcus observed, approaching the group. He'd been quiet during the family reunion, but now looked concerned. "Word about this morning's events is already spreading. The ranger station has been fielding calls from wildlife organizations, media outlets, and government officials all morning." Emma turned to Marcus with an expression Tom couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said formally, "for watching over him. I know it wasn't easy." "Actually," Marcus replied, glancing at Tom, "it was fascinating. Your father has become something of a local legend among the Maasai communities. They call him Daktari wa Wanyamapori, Doctor of Wild Animals. His reputation extends far beyond the official volunteer program." Tom felt heat rise in his cheeks. "That's an exaggeration." "Is it?" Captain Kimani had arrived and overheard the conversation. "Dr. Harrison, in 8 months you've successfully treated more wildlife injuries than most veterinarians see in a lifetime. And today," he gestured toward the lion pride, still visible in the distance, "today you accomplished something that wildlife experts said was impossible." Emma was staring at the lions again, and Tom could see her professional mind working. "They're not leaving," she observed. "Even with all these people and vehicles, they're maintaining visual contact. That's not normal behavior for wild lions." "Nothing about this morning has been normal," Tom admitted. "They protected me while I worked, cooperated in ways I've never seen before. It was like they understood that I was trying to help." Sarah was taking notes rapidly. "This needs to be documented properly. The behavioral implications alone could change how we understand human-animal interactions in the wild." Captain Kimani nodded grimly. "Which brings us to our next problem. This story is going to attract attention. Researchers, media, possibly trophy hunters who want to claim they've encountered the miracle lions. We need to consider relocating the pride for their protection." "No." The word came out of Tom's mouth before he'd fully formed the thought. "You can't separate them from their territory. This is their home. Dr. Harrison, with respect, the safety of both the animals and the human population has to be our priority," Kimani replied. "If this story goes viral, and it will, We'll have tourists and thrill-seekers flooding the area. The Pride could become a target. Tom looked at the lions, still maintaining their dignified distance. The injured male was resting in the shade of an acacia tree, but his golden eyes remained fixed on the human gathering. Tom had the unsettling feeling that the great cat was following every word of their conversation. "There has to be another way," Tom said. "They've shown unprecedented trust in humans. Moving them could destroy that bond permanently." Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying the scene with the analytical eye she'd inherited from both her parents. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of decision that Tom recognized from Dorothy. "What if we didn't move the Pride," she said slowly, "but instead created a protected research environment around them? A legitimate scientific study that would provide protection while advancing our understanding of human-animal relationships." The suggestion hung in the air while everyone considered its implications. Sarah looked intrigued. Captain Kimani appeared thoughtful, and Marcus was nodding slowly. But it was Tom who understood the full weight of what Emma was proposing. "You're talking about staying," he said. "Here." "In Kenya." Emma met his eyes directly. "I'm talking about family, Dad. About finding a way to heal the wounds we've both been carrying. About honoring Mom's memory by doing work that matters." She paused, glancing at the lions. "And maybe, if we're very lucky, learning something from creatures who understand loyalty better than we do." In the distance, as if responding to her words, the injured lion lifted his massive head and released a soft roar that echoed across the savanna. It wasn't a sound of pain or anger, but something that sounded remarkably like acknowledgement. Tom felt Dorothy's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him, and he could almost hear her voice. "This is what I wanted for you, Tommy. Not just something worth living for, but someone to live it with." The revelation came 3 hours later, as they sat around a makeshift camp table reviewing the medical documentation of the lion encounter. Emma had been unusually quiet, making notes with the focused intensity that Tom remembered from her veterinary school days. Captain Kimani was coordinating with headquarters about establishing the research zone, while Sarah uploaded preliminary footage to the wildlife database. Marcus sat slightly apart from the group, fidgeting with his radio equipment in a way that suggested he was avoiding conversation. It was Emma who broke the silence, setting down her pen with deliberate precision. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you about why I really came to Kenya." Tom looked up from the photographs Sarah had taken of his field surgery, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. "I thought you came because you were worried about me." "I am. But that's not the whole truth." Emma reached into her field pack and withdrew a manila envelope, edges worn from handling. "I received this 3 weeks ago, from Mom's lawyer. She left instructions that it should be delivered exactly 3 years after her death." Tom's heart began to pound as Emma slid the envelope across the table. His name was written on it in Dorothy's distinctive handwriting, the ink slightly faded but unmistakably hers. Below his name, in smaller letters, "To be opened only after our daughter understands." Understands what? Tom's voice was barely a whisper. Emma's composure cracked slightly. "That she wasn't my biological mother." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. He stared at his daughter, the woman he'd raised from infancy, whose scraped knees he'd bandaged, whose first steps he'd cheered, whose graduation from veterinary school had been one of the proudest moments of his life. "What are you talking about?" "I was adopted, Dad." "When I was 6 months old?" Emma's voice was steady, but tears were beginning to track down her cheeks. Mom's letter explained everything, how they'd tried for years to have children, the miscarriages, the failed fertility treatments, and then a social worker called about a baby whose teenage mother couldn't care for her. Tom felt the world tilting around him. Memories cascaded through his mind. Emma's arrival, which he'd always attributed to Dorothy's pregnancy, being kept quiet due to previous losses. The lack of baby pictures from the first few months. Dorothy's fierce protectiveness, which he'd thought was natural maternal instinct. "You knew," Emma continued, her voice gaining strength. "You had to know. The adoption papers required both signatures, but you never treated me as anything less than your daughter. Not once, not ever." Tom opened the envelope with trembling hands. Dorothy's letter was written in the careful script she'd used for important documents, each word chosen with deliberate care. "My dearest Tommy, if you're reading this, it means our Emma has finally learned the truth about her origins, and I pray she understands what you've always known, that love makes a family, not biology. You signed those adoption papers without hesitation, claiming her as your own before you'd even held her. You never once treated her as anything less than the miracle we'd prayed for. I kept this secret not out of shame, but out of gratitude. Emma was your daughter from the moment we brought her home, and I didn't want the world to suggest otherwise. But she deserves to know the depth of your love, that you chose her completely and without reservation when you could have walked away. I see you both struggling now, pushing each other away when you need each other most. Emma doesn't know how to reach you through your grief, and you don't know how to let her try. But you're family in the truest sense, and family finds a way. Find your way back to each other, Tommy. Find something worth living for together. All my love, Dorothy." Tom read the letter twice, his vision blurring as the implications settled over him. Emma watched his face, her own emotions carefully controlled, but clearly fragile. "There's more," she said quietly. "I hired Marcus to find my biological parents. It took him 3 months, but he tracked down the information." Marcus, who had been silent throughout Emma's revelation, finally spoke. "Her biological mother was Linda van der Merwe, my sister." The final piece clicked into place with devastating clarity. Tom stared at Marcus, seeing Emma's eyes reflected in the other man's features, recognizing the familiar stubborn set of his jaw. "You're her uncle." "I was 23 when Linda got pregnant," Marcus said, his voice heavy with old guilt. "Just back from military service, trying to figure out my life. She was 19, terrified. Our parents had disowned her. I wanted to help, but I was barely surviving myself. When she decided on adoption, I thought it was for the best." Emma leaned forward, her professional composure finally cracking completely. "I spent my entire adult life feeling like I didn't quite fit, like there was something missing. The distance between us after Mom died, I thought it meant you'd stopped loving me. I thought maybe you'd only loved me because of her." "Emma, no." Tom reached across the table, grasping her hands in his weathered ones. "Every moment of every day, you have been the greatest joy of my life. Your first word, your first step, the day you decided to become a veterinarian, you are my daughter in every way that matters." "But I needed to know," she continued, tears flowing freely now. "I needed to understand my history, my genetics, my medical background. Marcus has been helping me piece together my biological family tree while I worked up the courage to confront you about the distance between us." Marcus was studying his hands, clearly uncomfortable with being at the center of this family reunion. "When Emma contacted me 6 months ago, I thought it was just another case. A client wanting information about biological relatives. I had no idea it would lead to—" He gestured around them, encompassing the African landscape, the lion pride in the distance, the emotional wreckage of 3 decades of family secrets. "When did you realize?" Tom asked Emma. 3 weeks ago, when Marcus called to say he'd tracked you to Kenya. He'd been monitoring your volunteer work, documenting your achievements. When he described your work with the Wildlife Medical Program, your reputation among the local communities, the lives you'd saved, Emma smiled through her tears. I realized I'd inherited more than just your stubborn streak. I'd inherited your calling. Tom looked between Emma and Marcus, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. His daughter, not adopted but chosen. His brother-in-law, not a poacher but a protector trying to reunite a fractured family. The lion encounter that had seemed so random, so miraculous, was actually the culmination of months of careful coordination. "The trap," he said suddenly. "This morning. That wasn't coincidence." Marcus shook his head. "I've been tracking real poachers in this sector for weeks. When Emma decided to fly in and confront you directly, I thought I could coordinate the timing. Keep you safe while she worked up the courage to approach. I never intended for you to encounter active trapping operations." "But I did," Tom said, looking toward the lion pride, "and something unprecedented happened. Those animals trusted me in a way that defies everything we know about wild predator behavior." Dr. Chen, who had been quietly documenting their conversation, looked up from her notes. "The behavioral data from this morning is going to revolutionize animal psychology research. The lions' protective response, their cooperation during the medical procedure, their continued observation of human activity, it's all unprecedented." Emma wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, transforming back into the professional veterinarian Tom had raised her to be. "Which brings us to the real question. What do we do now?" The question hung in the air as the African sun began its descent toward the horizon. In the distance, the lion pride had settled into afternoon rest, but the injured male remained alert, his golden eyes occasionally scanning the human encampment. Captain Kamani was still coordinating with headquarters. Sarah was preparing her research documentation, and Marcus continued monitoring radio communications. Tom looked at his daughter, his chosen daughter, his real daughter, his greatest achievement, and felt Dorothy's presence as strongly as if she were sitting beside him. The letter in his hands contained her final gift, the truth that would heal the wound he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "Now," Tom said, his voice steady with newfound purpose, "we figure out how to be a family again. All of us. And maybe, if we're very fortunate, we learn something from those lions about what loyalty really means." Emma reached across the table and took the letter from his hands, reading her mother's words one more time. When she looked up, her smile was radiant with possibility. "Mom always said you had healing hands, Dad. I think it's time we put them to work healing more than just wounded animals." In the distance, as if responding to her words, the injured lion rose to his feet and took several strong steps toward their camp. He stopped at what appeared to be a carefully calculated distance, close enough to demonstrate trust, far enough to maintain dignity. Then, in a gesture that would be analyzed by animal behaviorists for years to come, he settled into a resting position that allowed him to keep watch over the humans who had saved his life. The message was clear. The healing had only just begun. 6 months later, Tom Harrison stood on the porch of the Harrison Wildlife Research Station, watching the morning sun paint the Masai Mara in shades of gold and amber. The converted ranger station had become their home, their laboratory, and their mission headquarters, all in one. Emma emerged from the clinic building, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and wearing the practical khaki uniform that had become her daily uniform. "Patient update," she announced, settling into the chair beside his. "Aslan's leg has healed completely, no signs of infection, full range of motion restored. Dr. Chen thinks we should submit the case study to the International Journal of Wildlife Medicine." Tom accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how natural it felt to have someone to share morning routines with again. And the pride? Thriving. The lionesses have integrated the new territory beautifully, and Aslan's leadership has never been stronger. Emma pulled out a tablet displaying GPS tracking data. But here's the interesting part. They've established what appears to be a protective patrol pattern around our research station. Nothing threatening gets within a half-mile radius without the Pride investigating. It had taken weeks for the scientific community to accept what Tom and Emma were documenting. Wild lions actively protecting human researchers went against every established principle of predator behavior. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Aslan's Pride had become unofficial guardians of the research station, their presence deterring poachers and aggressive wildlife while allowing peaceful species to flourish in the area. "Marcus called this morning," Emma continued. "The anti-poaching task force has made 14 arrests this month. Apparently, word has spread through the criminal networks that this sector is cursed, protected by lions that work with humans." Tom chuckled. Dorothy would have loved that. She always said the best way to fight criminals was to make them afraid of their own shadows. The mention of Dorothy no longer brought the sharp stab of grief that had dominated Tom's thoughts for 3 years. Instead, it brought warmth, gratitude for the time they'd shared and the wisdom she'd left behind. Her presence lived on in the research station they'd built, in the relationships they'd healed, and in the work that gave their lives meaning. A distant roar echoed across the savannah, and both Tom and Emma automatically looked toward the Pride's territory. Aslan stood on a rocky outcropping, his magnificent mane catching the morning light as he surveyed his domain. As if sensing their attention, the great lion turned toward the research station and released another call, not aggressive or territorial, but something that sounded remarkably like greeting. "He knows we're watching," Emma observed. 6 months, and I still can't get used to the intelligence in those eyes." "The intelligence was always there," Tom replied. "We just learned how to recognize it." The research data they'd collected was revolutionizing the field of human-animal interaction studies. Universities around the world were sending graduate students to study their methods. Documentary crews had filmed 3 separate programs about the miracle pride of Masai Mara. But for Tom, the real miracle was sitting beside him, sharing coffee and morning observations with the daughter he'd thought he'd lost to grief and misunderstanding. "I got a letter from home yesterday," Emma said, her tone carefully neutral. "From Dr. Peterson at the San Diego clinic." Tom felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Emma had taken a leave of absence from her successful California practice to join him in Kenya, but they'd never discussed whether the arrangement was temporary or permanent. "He's offering you senior partnership," Tom guessed. "Full partnership, with my choice of specializations and a research budget." Emma set down her coffee and looked at him directly. "It's everything I thought I wanted when I was building my career. But it doesn't include lions who remember kindness, or morning coffee with my father, or the satisfaction of knowing that our work is literally saving lives every day." She gestured toward the clinic building where they'd treated everything from injured elephant calves to wounded rangers. "I've learned more about veterinary medicine in 6 months than I did in 5 years of private practice." Tom felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. "Emma, I can't ask you to give up your career for an old man's redemption project." "You're not asking. I'm choosing." Her voice carried the same determination he'd heard during their first reunion. "This isn't your redemption project anymore, Dad. It's our mission, and it's bigger than either of us imagined." She was right, Tom realized. What had started as his attempt to outrun grief had evolved into something significant. The Harrison Wildlife Research Station had become a model for human-animal cooperation studies. Their joint papers on emergency field veterinary techniques were being implemented across Africa. The anti-poaching program they'd helped establish had reduced wildlife crime in their sector by over 60%. "There's something else," Emma continued, her voice taking on a note of excitement. "The Kenyan government wants to expand our program. 5 new research stations, each focused on different aspects of human-wildlife interaction. They're calling it the Harrison Initiative. The Harrison Initiative? Tom felt overwhelmed by the scope of what Emma was describing. Named after the veterinary team that proved interspecies cooperation isn't just possible, it's revolutionary. Emma pulled out official-looking documents. They want you to serve as Director of Field Operations and me as Head of Veterinary Research. Full funding, international support, and the backing of 3 major universities. Tom stared at the papers, struggling to process how his desperate flight from grief had somehow transformed into a career pinnacle he'd never imagined. Emma, this is your opportunity. You don't need an old man slowing you down. Stop it. Emma's voice carried Dorothy's no-nonsense tone. You're 63, not 93, and you're the most respected field veterinarian in East Africa, according to these documents. Besides, her expression softened, I've already lost 3 years with my father. I'm not wasting any more time. As if summoned by their conversation, Aslan appeared at the edge of their compound. The great lion had made this morning visit a routine, checking on his Human Pride members before beginning his daily territorial rounds. Tom and Emma sat quietly as the magnificent creature approached to within 20 feet, close enough to demonstrate trust, far enough to maintain dignity. You know what I think he's saying? Emma asked quietly. What? Thank you. Every morning he comes to say thank you for giving him back his life. Tom watched the lion's golden eyes, seeing the intelligence and awareness that had first captured his attention 6 months ago. Maybe he's saying what Dorothy used to tell me every morning. Which was, find something worth living for today. And if you're lucky, find someone to share it with. Aslan held their gazes for another moment, then turned and padded back toward his pride. His gait was strong and confident, showing no trace of the injury that had nearly killed him. At the edge of the compound, he paused and looked back once more, a gesture that had become as routine as sunrise. Emma stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the research station they'd built together. So what do you say, Dad? Ready to save the world one animal at a time? Tom joined her at the railing, placing his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that felt natural again after months of rebuilding their relationship. I say your mother would be proud of what we've accomplished, and I can't think of anything I'd rather do than continue this work with my daughter. Our daughter, Emma corrected gently, echoing Dorothy's letter. Mom made that clear. Biology doesn't make family. Choice does. In the distance, Aslan's pride was beginning their morning activities. The lionesses were organizing hunting strategies while cubs played under watchful supervision. It was a picture of family cooperation that had taught Tom and Emma as much about relationships as any human psychology text. Together? Emma asked, holding out the government documents. Together, Tom confirmed, accepting the papers that would formalize their partnership and extend their mission across Kenya. As they began reviewing the proposal details, Aslan's roar echoed once more across the savannah. Not a farewell, but a promise. The healing that had begun with a trapped lion and a grieving father had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. A legacy of hope, family, and the unbreakable bonds that connect all living creatures. The Harrison Initiative would touch thousands of lives, but it had started with just 2. A man who'd lost his way and the daughter who'd helped him find it again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Harrison Wildlife Research Station as Tom Harrison, now 64, prepared for what would become the most challenging day of his new life. 2 years had passed since he and Emma had formalized their partnership, and the Harrison Initiative had grown beyond their wildest expectations. 5 research stations now operated across Kenya, each one a testament to the revolutionary approach they'd pioneered, combining traditional veterinary medicine with unprecedented human-animal cooperation protocols. Emma emerged from the main clinic building, her stride purposeful but her expression troubled. At 37, she had grown into her role as head of veterinary research with the same determination that had driven her successful California practice, but with a depth of purpose that her previous work had never provided. The African sun had weathered her features slightly, giving her the same practical beauty that Tom remembered in Dorothy at that age. "We have a problem," she announced without preamble, settling into the chair beside his on the porch that had become their daily conference room. "Dr. Patterson called from the Amboseli station. They've encountered something that challenges everything we think we know about our work here." Tom set down his coffee, noting the tension in Emma's voice. In 2 years of field work, they'd documented dozens of unprecedented human-animal interactions. But Emma's expression suggested this was different, more significant, perhaps more dangerous. "Another cooperative species?" Tom asked. "The elephant research has been producing remarkable results." "Not cooperation," Emma replied, pulling out her tablet to display video footage. "This is different. Potentially revolutionary, but also controversial enough to threaten our entire program if we're not careful how we handle it." The video showed a scene that made Tom's breath catch. Dr. Patterson, the Amboseli station director, was performing emergency surgery on an injured elephant calf, while a circle of adult elephants maintained protective positions around the medical team. But that wasn't the extraordinary part. The extraordinary part was that the elephants were actively assisting in the procedure. One female was using her trunk to provide shade, another was bringing water-soaked vegetation for cooling, and the matriarch was positioning her massive body to create a windbreak. "Coordinated medical assistance," Tom breathed. "They're not just tolerating human intervention, they're participating in it." "It gets more complex," Emma continued, advancing the video to show the aftermath. "After the surgery was complete, the elephant herd didn't just leave. They've established a permanent camp around the research station. Dr. Patterson reports that they're bringing other injured animals to the facility. Yesterday, they guided a wounded buffalo to the medical team." Tom stared at the screen, his mind racing through the implications. What they'd achieved with Aslan's pride had been remarkable enough to revolutionize wildlife research. But if elephants, creatures with complex social structures and problem-solving abilities that rivaled human intelligence, were actively recruiting human medical intervention for their community, the ramifications extended far beyond veterinary science. "How is the international community responding?" Tom asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Divided," Emma said grimly. "Half the scientific establishment is calling it the most significant breakthrough in human-animal relations in recorded history. The other half is questioning our methodology and suggesting we've somehow trained or conditioned these animals artificially. And the media? Sensationalizing it naturally. CNN is calling it the Elephant Hospital of Kenya. National Geographic wants exclusive documentary rights, and unfortunately some less reputable outlets are spinning it as evidence that we're interfering with natural selection and disrupting evolutionary processes." Tom rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of unexpected controversy settling on his shoulders. At 64, he'd hoped his days of fighting for professional credibility were behind him. But the success of the Harrison Initiative had thrust them into international spotlight, and with visibility came scrutiny. "There's more," Emma continued. "The Kenyan government is under pressure from international conservation groups to suspend our operations, pending a full investigation of our methods. They're specifically questioning whether our success rate with predator rehabilitation is artificially enhanced through conditioning or feeding programs." "Which is ridiculous," Tom said angrily. "Every interaction is documented, every procedure is filmed. Our animals are completely wild. We've never used any form of conditioning beyond standard medical treatment. I know that. You know that. But explaining it to bureaucrats and skeptics who've never worked in the field is a different challenge entirely. Emma's voice carried the frustration of a scientist facing political interference with pure research. Dr. Chen thinks we need to invite independent observers to witness our procedures, prove that what we're achieving is genuine interspecies cooperation, not some elaborate training program. Tom considered the proposal while watching the elephant footage replay. The idea of outside observers concerned him, not because he doubted their methods, but because the animals' trust had been built slowly, carefully, over months of consistent interaction. Introducing strangers could disrupt the delicate relationships they'd worked so hard to establish. "What does Marcus think?" Tom asked. Marcus had become an unofficial member of their research family, coordinating security and anti-poaching efforts across all 5 stations. "He's worried about media attention attracting the wrong kind of visitors," Emma replied. "Trophy hunters, thrill seekers, people who might try to exploit our animals' trust for personal gain. He's already had to increase security patrols around all our facilities." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. Tom recognized the distinctive engine note of the government Land Rovers that transported visiting officials. Through the dust clouds, he could see multiple vehicles, more than the usual single truck that brought routine supplies or personnel. "Expecting anyone?" Emma asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "No," Tom replied, standing to get a better view. "But I suspect our conversation about independent observers just became academic." The convoy consisted of 3 vehicles carrying what appeared to be a mixture of government officials, international researchers, and media representatives. Tom recognized the lead figure emerging from the first truck, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, director of the International Wildlife Conservation Alliance, whose organization provided significant funding for African research programs. Emma stood beside him, her posture shifting into the professional stance she'd perfected during high-stakes veterinary consultations. "Dr. Morrison doesn't make surprise visits for routine inspections," she observed. "No, she doesn't," Tom agreed. "Which means whatever brought her here is significant enough to potentially affect our entire program." As the visitors approached, Tom noticed something else that concerned him. Dr. Morrison's expression was carefully neutral, the diplomatic mask worn by officials delivering news that might be unwelcome. Behind her, a younger man was already setting up video equipment, suggesting this wasn't just a fact-finding mission, but a formal investigation being documented for potential public release. "Dr. Harrison, Dr. Harrison," Dr. Morrison called out as she approached the porch. "Thank you for receiving us on such short notice. I'm afraid we have some urgent matters to discuss regarding the Harrison Initiative and its future operations." Emma stepped forward, extending her hand professionally. "Dr. Morrison, welcome to our station. Though I have to admit, your arrival feels more like an intervention than a consultation." Dr. Morrison's smile was diplomatic, but strained. "I suppose that's not entirely inaccurate. We've received some concerning reports about your methodologies, and the International Conservation Alliance has been asked to conduct a formal review of your program's compliance with established wildlife interaction protocols." Tom felt his heart sink. A formal review meant potential suspension of operations, possible loss of funding, and worst of all, the potential separation of the animal communities that had come to trust their medical intervention. The lions, elephants, and dozens of other species that had learned to seek human help when injured could be left without the support they'd grown to depend on. "What kind of concerns?" Emma asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Questions about whether your success rate indicates artificial conditioning of wildlife, potential disruption of natural behavioral patterns, and most seriously, whether your animals pose a safety risk to the general public due to their reduced fear of humans." Dr. Morrison replied, reading from an official document. Tom looked toward Aslan's territory, where the pride was visible in the distance. The great lion seemed to sense the tension around the research station, his posture alert as he observed the unusual human activity. For 2 years, that pride had served as unofficial guardians of their work, their presence a symbol of the trust and cooperation that had made everything else possible. Now, that same trust might be the evidence used to destroy everything they'd built together. At 55-68, you've likely experienced the pain of being misunderstood, of having your life's work questioned, or watching something precious threatened by forces beyond your control. Like Tom Harrison, you may have discovered that your greatest achievements sometimes come after your darkest moments, when everyone else has written you off as too old or past your prime. But here's what the skeptics don't understand. Experience isn't a limitation. It's your superpower. Your decades of wisdom, your battle-tested resilience, and your hard-earned perspective are exactly what this world needs. Tom didn't find his true purpose until he was 62, proving that your most meaningful chapters might still be unwritten. The question isn't whether you're too old to make a difference. It's whether you're brave enough to trust that your time for greatness hasn't passed. What moment in your life made you realize that your experience was actually your greatest strength, not a limitation? Have you ever felt like giving up on a dream only to discover it was just beginning to unfold?